I need to leave the name of the specific town that this happened in out, as it would be a dead giveaway to my real identity. I've always been into the paranormal, as most of us that visit these channels are. In January of 2019, I noticed something lumbering down my driveway. The window I was looking at faces over and above the driveway, if that's clear. For example, I can see the roof of your car, but not always the bottom of the tire. Regardless of this, I noticed movement. I look out and see what I initially thought was a bear, nose to the ground, kind of moving its head from side to side, casually walking down the drive on all fours. For a little geographical clarity, I live in town. The front of my neighborhood faces a major highway, but the back is all state game lands. I've seen some wildlife, turkeys, a deer here and there, and every skunk in the county apparently lives on my street. I don't see many squirrels, groundhogs, or chipmunks, which is a bit odd. I'm not very far from the city of Scranton, and I'm about 7 miles from downtown, so I'm not exactly in the sticks. So I watch this bear just mosey down towards the street, its head still lowered. I move from the living room window to my bedroom window that has a full view of the street, and sure enough, here it comes. But something is wrong, because I watch this, not a bear, stand on 2 legs, and casually walk out into the road. I see pointed ears and a long snout. It's got its head raised, smelling the air. I felt pee run down my legs. This was no bear. I saw it in perfect silhouette under the streetlight. It was either gray or black. The yellow light of the streetlight threw off the true color. It stood without effort and looked like one fluid movement. It then walked across the road, casual as you please, and kind of hunkered down in some scrub brush. And then I realized, this thing is looking right into my bedroom. It had blue eyes. I'm not sure if that was reflected light or if they were glowing. And it looked right at me. I lost my legs at that moment and sat down under my window, absolutely panicked. I was home alone with 5 cats and a dog who slept through the whole damn thing. I didn't know what else to do. My window is a big picture window, and if it wanted me, it easily could have gotten me. I cautiously got to my knees and peeked over the sill, and I lost it. I didn't see eyes or it anywhere. It seemed to be either moving away from the forest behind my house, or it decided to rest up on that scrub brush. What I saw under that streetlight is as follows. Darkish fur, high pointed ears, a long muzzle. I never saw teeth, or if it had a tail. It had long hands with long claws that hung kind of limp wrist. If they were fully extended, they would have hung below the knee. It walked digit grade, on dog legs. It looked heavily muscled, but it was tapered at the waist. It was about 7 to 7.5 feet tall, judging from where it stood in relation to the streetlight. It was non-aggressive, even when I felt it look right at me. I was terrified, but I didn't get a sense that it was pissed off that it had been seen, as some people do report. I didn't take a picture because I simply didn't think to. I was in a fair amount of shock, and I'm sure I'll eat shit for this, but sometimes your phone is the absolute last thing on your mind. There have been some odd sounds around my house. Tapping at my window. I can hear scratching at the siding sometimes. I don't see that many animals around the neighborhood anymore. There used to be about 7 stray cats I fed. All gone. Once the weather broke, it's been quiet. I installed motion lights and bought 2 game cameras. I'm hoping that Dogman have the same sense like a Sasquatch, where they try to avoid game cams. I don't ever want to see this thing again. Those of you who want to see one, pray you never do. My encounter was non-aggressive. I can't imagine having to deal with this thing pissed off. I still can't even sleep a full night, and every sound scares the hell out of me after dark. I live alone, and the 357 I own would probably just ruffle its fur. Thank you for taking time to share this story. It was a terrifying animal to see. Be careful out there. You never know what's out there waiting. And one last thing, another disturbing thought. If Dogman is real, what the F else is? Good night. The scariest thing that ever happened to me was in 1995, while we were still living in Puerto Rico. We immigrated to the United States in 2001, but before we did, we lived on my grandparents' property. We witnessed something that most people think is fictitious, but it really did happen to us. My name is Gabriel, but you can call me Gabe. I was only 7 years old at the time that my father was attacked by this creature, but I remember it very vividly. I remember how hurt he looked and how we had to take him to the hospital. It was very scary for a kid my age to see his father covered in blood and talking about a creature that had attacked him. Our household consisted of my grandparents, my mother and father, my 2 older brothers, myself, and my little sister. My father was the only one that went out there the night of the attack, and consequently was the only person that was injured by that creature that he was trying to scare off of our home. My grandfather used to raise parakeets for money. He was also a carpenter, but the parakeets provided a side income that he would use to spend on things that he and my grandmother wanted. I loved going out and looking at them. I loved all the different colors that they had. There were 20 to 30 parakeets at any given time. He used to keep them in this big chicken coop that had all these little houses that they could go in and breed with each other. He took very good care of them, and even kept some of them as pets. I always used to ask my mom and dad if I could keep one, and they told me in a few years they would let me have one for my birthday. I really liked the ones that were blue and white with the black stripes on the wings. But anyway, one night, all these birds were going crazy. You could hear all of them flapping and crying out like they were scared. I wanted to go outside with them and see what was going on, but my father told me that I was too little and had to stay inside with my mom. So my father, my older brother, and my grandfather all went out to see what was going on, thinking that there was a cat or some other kind of animal out there that was trying to get into the coop and eat the parakeets. When they went out there, they didn't see anything, but they said the air felt funny to them. All 3 of them described the air as making them tingle, like static electricity or something. My grandfather even said that he felt dizzy while he was out there. All 3 of them heard strange noises and described them as hisses and growls. They were coming from the bushes, and then they heard something move, and they heard the hisses up in a tree. But they looked around and couldn't find anything. All 3 of them were confused because, as far as they knew, nothing around where we lived would prey on parakeets, unless it was a cat. But it didn't sound like a cat. I remember being frightened. That night, I didn't even want to sleep. I was thinking it was some kind of monster, and I ended up sleeping in my grandparents' room. My grandma told me there was no such thing as monsters, and that helped calm me down enough to where I could actually fall asleep. The next morning, I got teased by my older brothers for being a wimp because I slept with my grandparents, but I didn't care. It was a comfort for me. A few nights later, while my grandparents were in town, and my older brother was at his job, we heard the same ruckus. The parakeets started going crazy again and acting very frightened. My father ran out there with a flashlight and a club and told my other brother and my mom to keep me in the house and keep an eye on my little sister. When he ran to the chicken coop, he found that the door was broken open and the parakeets were all fluttering around, very scared. They couldn't fly away because their wings were clipped. It was just one of the precautions my grandpa took so he wouldn't lose any of the birds. But anyway, my father found a few birds that were already dead and saw this creature with another bird in its hands. My father told us later that he thought it was the devil. He thought it'd come to our home and then started eating these poor birds. But at the end, my grandfather had a better idea of what it could be. My father described this creature as greenish-brown in color, and it looked like it could have been covered in scales, but it also had a little bit of hair on it too. It was standing on 2 legs and had long claws and toes on the hands. The hands only had a few fingers, but my dad isn't sure exactly how many. It had these big, bulbous red eyes that looked like they were glowing. No nose, and a mouth full of big teeth. It came up almost to his waist in height, and the legs looked very muscular for a creature of its size. It had what my father thinks were spikes or spines on its back, and only a small bit of white fur that was on the legs, the chest, and the back. There was no hair anywhere on its head or face. My father raced up to it with his club and began beating at it and yelling at it to go away. He was telling it that God demanded that it leave, and no evil was welcome on this property. He chased this thing around in there, beating it with the club while it was making this horrible screaming noise. That part we could actually hear from inside the house. It sounded like nothing I've ever heard before in my entire life. I've never heard anything like that since either, but it's still something that I can hear in my mind. As these two were running around in the coop, the parakeets were still going crazy, and this creature was moving in a hopping motion, but was very fast. My dad was trying to block the doorway so he could beat this thing to death, but it managed to escape anyway. It ran through the door, but my dad kept beating on it. Outside of the coop, it made the scream, but even louder this time, and then turned around to defend itself. When it turned, it leapt in the air and pounced on my dad and attacked him. It tried to claw him, but my dad kept fighting it off and hitting it with the club and punching it with his free hand. They ended up falling to the ground, and my dad started kicking at this creature as it clawed at his arms and legs. My dad described the claws as talons like a bird of prey. They were long and curved and sharp. As it was attacking him, it kept making that horrible screaming noise, and it would hiss at him as well. He was finally able to beat the creature off, and it ran into the bushes. The same bushes that they believed they heard this thing in the first time. When it did run off, it was still making that hopping motion that my dad described kind of like a kangaroo. The creature was gone, but my dad was very hurt. We took him to the local hospital, and the doctors treated his wounds. He had a lot of slashes and cuts on him from the creature, and when he fell, he scraped up his legs and hands. He ended up getting a lot of stitches and was taken off work for a few weeks to heal, and he was also given a couple of injections of antibiotics and sent home with some too. When he was brought home from the hospital, we all sat around the dinner table as a family, and he described what happened to him. He told us what he'd seen. My mom was convinced that it was a demon, but my grandparents had other ideas. Grandfather was convinced that it was the chupacabra. That was a creature that I never gave two thoughts about existing. It was just a fairy tale. It was only told to me when I was acting up, tried to keep me in line. My brothers used to talk about the chupacabra and told me that it was imaginary. It was a tactic that my parents used to scare us into behaving. After that night, the entire family believed in the existence of chupacabras, because my dad had actually fought one off. We never saw that creature again, but my dad still has the scars to prove that he was attacked by some sort of creature. There's nothing else in Puerto Rico that matches the description of the chupacabra, and in fact, there's no other creature on Earth that matches the description that our dad gave us. I believe him. I believe he was attacked by the chupacabra that night, and I thank God every night to this day that he was able to survive the encounter. In 2015, I was hunting in Jackson County, Kentucky, and ran into one of the dogmen. I was up in a blind when it happened. I'd been there about an hour and hadn't seen a single buck, which was weird in its own right. Right before it happened, I heard something moving through the trees. I heard sticks snapping and leaves shuffling. Whatever it was moving along pretty quickly. I got my rifle ready in case it was a buck, and damn near shit myself when the dogman came into view. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. It was a monster on two legs, just walking through the middle of the forest like he owned the damn place. You could describe what I saw just like the werewolves in Underworld. Big mouth, big ears, big head, muscular arms and chest, backwards legs, and a big tail. It was black, and it looked dangerous, and it looked mean. I watched in silence as it walked underneath my blind, and I was hoping I'd sprayed enough scent killer on myself to make it so he couldn't smell me. Then I smelled him, and he smelled horrible, like blood, pee, and wet dog, like a wet dog that'd been out in the sun all day and peeing all over himself. I watched as it walked right under me and stopped. My heart stopped too. I was only about 4 or 5 feet above him. Way too close. My heart was pounding so hard and I was sweating so profusely that I was sure one of those two things was going to be a dead giveaway of my location. Then this damn thing sniffed the air and looked right up at the blind and growled. I thought I was dead for sure. I thought this thing was going to knock the blind from the tree and eat me. It stayed there for what felt like forever. It circled the tree once and growled, circled the tree a second time, and sniffed the air again. I think it was frustrated that it couldn't get to me. I thought about shooting it, but I didn't for a few reasons. One, what if it had some buddies out there? I mean, wolves travel in packs, right? Well, do werewolves travel in packs too? I wasn't about to find out the hard way. The second reason was the angle. It was right underneath me, so I'd have had to expose myself to shoot it, and I wasn't about to do that either. So I just lay there on my belly, tucked into myself as close as I could get, clutching my rifle and praying that it would just go away. And then, to my relief, it did. But not before letting out the most frightening and deafening roar I've ever heard in my entire life. One time I was out bear hunting, and a grizzly bear charged me. In that moment I thought I was dead. The roar that thing let out was terrifying, and up until this moment, it was the scariest moment of my entire life. And even though I knew this thing wasn't able to get me now, this was still scarier. I could feel the roar vibrate through my body, especially in my chest. Without even thinking, I let my rifle go and my hands shot up to my ears. I started to cry. I started to pray. I tried to calm myself down, but I could still feel the fear overwhelming my body. And even after this thing took off back into the woods, I laid there for over an hour, not wanting to move, not knowing if it was waiting out in the woods for me, not knowing if it was going to get the rest of its pack so they could attack and kill me. All I could do was think about my wife and our daughters, and how if this thing got me, they might never even know what happened to me. I finally built up the courage to look around, and I did that for another 10 minutes or so. Then I climbed halfway down and jumped the rest of the way, and I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, and then I sped all the way home. I still haven't been back out there hunting. I will never go back out there hunting.
The aswang is a Filipino version of the boogeyman. There are many types, from ghosts to mythological creatures to shapeshifters, depending on the stories. My experience happened when I was 9 to 11 years old. My mom and my 2 brothers, 7 and 2, sleep in one bed. I woke up in the middle of the night. I sat up and I was holding a throw pillow because I didn't have a blanket. My right eye was covered while my left eye was opened. What I saw shocked me. There were 2 women sitting on the bed. One I saw clear as day while the other was obstructed by my pillow. The woman had messy hair and the skin was kind of wrinkly, like a lizard, and this gray color. They were just sitting there, very still and not moving, but not staring at me either. I slowly lied down on the bed again. As I was already lying on the bed, they started to move closer to me. I must have felt her skin because my foot felt something that was cold and had the soft texture of a diaper. I inched my way away from them, and they also inched their way closer to me. I kept moving away from them until I hit the corner wall. Our bed was in the corner of the room, and I thought to myself, now I die. I didn't have a blanket. All I had was that throw pillow. I used it to cover my face. What happened next was even freakier than seeing these 2 women on my bed. I heard a weird sound while they were doing something to my hair. I don't know if they were running their hands through my hair, but the sound seemed to go with it. At the time, I thought they were biting my hair and letting it run through their teeth. The sound I heard is like when you scratch your arm, but in long, fast strokes. Then my mom yelled out, "Get away from here, you bad spirits." And then it stopped. I mustered up all the courage to open my eyes and see that they weren't around. I saw my brother had a blanket on, and I grabbed it. The blanket was wrapped tight around my brother. I pulled as much as I could, and I only got about a foot of blanket to cover myself with. Now this blanket was skin tight on me, and I started praying to myself. Then the freakiness starts again. I feel hands feeling all over me, up and down my body, all the while hearing that scratching noise. I didn't sleep at all that night, and it felt like an eternity that I was under that blanket. I was so relieved when morning came. I told my mom about it, and she didn't believe me to my shock. I was shaking in fear, and I told her that I heard her call out to them to leave us alone. But I guess maybe she was just doing that in her sleep. The next night, I slept close to my mom, and I wanted the lamp to be left on, but my mom wouldn't leave it on. Later on that night, we heard flapping sounds, really loud flapping sounds. There must have been 2 or 3 entities making those noises. When the flapping stopped, my mom turned on the lights and told me to go sleep with my grandpa, because those flapping sounds could have come from a manananggal, which is like a flying vampire creature that doesn't have legs and its intestines hang out. It sucks your blood. Obviously, I was terrified, so I went to my grandpa's room, but that scared me even more, because his window was only covered by bamboo, and it's a big window. My grandpa tells me not to cover myself with a blanket, and that I shouldn't be afraid, and that I should yell back at it to leave me alone. As I was trying to go to sleep, I started to hear voices. I asked Grandpa if he heard them too, and he said no. The voice sounded like a man, and it was whispering a phrase that translates to, "Sleep now, children," and he kept saying it over and over again. Morning came, and this time my mom believed that I was afraid of the night. Nighttime always scares me. Every night I'd wake up feeling cold and warm at the same time. There was this one time I felt something weird touching and biting my legs. Like how you fold your lips over your teeth and try to bite yourself. I couldn't feel teeth, but I could feel the pressure. I would get vivid nightmares, and I'd be moving really, really slow in them. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with someone sleeping next to me, but when I turn on the flashlight I'm holding, nothing would be there. There was this one time my mom and I woke up in the middle of the night. The power had gone out. Our room is at the end of the hallway, and we keep our door open all the time. Our bed is situated so that you can see down the hallway. Well, on this particular night, we heard a loud click. Someone, or something, turned on the gas range. I could see the fire flicker down the hallway. Next, we heard footsteps that sounded like they were dancing, as if there were people dancing to the fire. They accidentally knocked down a cup, and they stopped for a while, but then they started dancing again. My mom had the house blessed, but all of this stuff still continued. There was this other time when someone sleeping next to me sat up and immediately ran out of the room. I was thinking that it was the aswang. It might have seen daylight and scurried out of the house, even though I didn't hear the front door or the back door open and close. Another time was when one of my grandmas came to visit. Out of the blue, she asked me if I wanted to sleep over at her house. That was the only time I slept through the night until morning without any type of interruption. My mom had a priest check me out. He told my mom to watch over me the next Tuesday and Thursday because they were going to take me away. Everyone in the house stayed up all night during Tuesday, but did nothing on Thursday, as nothing eventful happened on those dates. This happened to me for 2 entire years. The first year was rough. The second, not so much. I'd only wake up in the middle of the night with someone lying next to me and not be there in the morning. I know that sounds creepy, but it beats everything else that I had witnessed. It wasn't until 8 years later that my sister told me an aswang must have seen me and had a liking for me, because we'd go rollerblading in a subdivision down the road from our house. It stopped when we returned to live in Guam. From my understanding, this aswang might be a regular person with supernatural powers or something, and that her influence couldn't reach me from over 1,000 miles away.
I was in my mid-20s and dating a guy that loved camping and hiking just like I did. We took a trip to visit some of his friends in Kentucky. The couple lived on 150 acres in the middle of the Daniel Boone National Forest, and the road, if you could even call it that, to their house was a graded one-lane drive that meandered through deep woods. Neighbors there were few and far between, if at all. When we got to the house, I felt like I'd reached some kind of haven. They lived in a cleared part of the land. The man built log cabins for a living and had built their home. They lived entirely off the grid, with no electricity, a generator only for emergencies, a wood stove, and water piped in from a crystal clear creek that flowed from a cave on the property. And that cave seemed to be filled with native petroglyphs. The entire area just felt magical. The cabin was surrounded by the women's gardens. They grew all of their own fruit and vegetables, and had flowers everywhere. The yard was generous, and cleared areas were filled with this lush grass. The edge of their lawn met a tree line, and the creek was right there on the other side of those trees. We were stretching from a long drive, and the woman was showing me some of her gardens. The bed closest to the edge of the lawn area and to the tree line had all kinds of things planted there. I listened to her speak. She talked about everything she grew and canned, and I was just absorbed by her enthusiasm and that sweet Kentucky accent that she had. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this huge insect hovering around my shoulder height. I tried to ignore it, but it persisted, darting away and then coming back to hover. When I finally turned to look at the bug, I just remember gasping out loud. It was a tiny little being, and it was hovering right near me. He had short, dark hair, and his clothes looked like leaves. They were just that green color. His wings were flapping incredibly fast, like a hummingbird's do. As I stood there with my mouth open in shock, he put his hands up to his ears, closed his eyes, and blew a raspberry at me, then just darted off. I thought I was seeing things, but mind you, I was completely sober when this happened. I turned and looked at my host, and she saw my face and asked me with all the enthusiasm in the world, "Did you just see one of our fairies? We'll be able to see the lights tonight." Sure enough, as we sat on the porch that evening, the far lawn had these lights that would somehow show up and rise in the grass. They'd rise into the air and then come back down to the grass. They were not fireflies. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen in my entire life. My boyfriend and me camped in a tent outside, and when I woke early the next morning, I took a barefoot walk around, looking at all the flowers and wading in the creek. In my wanderings, I found a perfectly formed fairy circle in the grass. I've seen a lot of weird stuff in my life, but that had to be the most magical experience that I've ever had. I'm convinced that the couple put so much love and respect into their land that it invited that kind of magical presence. I also believe that these fairies are interdimensional, which is why we rarely see them and never find any remains. Hey man, thanks for presenting this for me. My name is Susan, but you can call me Sue. Everybody else does. This encounter happened to me and my girlfriend in Florida in 1985. We were just camping out in the Everglades, trying to have some time together, when this thing got in the way of that. When this encounter happened to me, I was 19 years old, and my girlfriend was 20 years old. I had just come out to my parents as a lesbian and wanted to introduce them to my girlfriend. I'd been dating Camille for about a year in secrecy, and I was finally ready to introduce her to my parents. They didn't approve of it, and that broke my heart. I was crazy about this girl, and I still am to this day. When she told her parents, she got the same results. Neither one of them accepted us as lesbians in their family, and neither of our families wanted to meet the other girl. We decided after that, to hell with them. We're going to go off on our own for a while. And during one of our trips, we ended up on this camping trip out in the Everglades. We just went out there to have fun and be together, but our experience was anything but fun, and to this day, I'm still confused about it. I'm absolutely convinced that what we encountered those nights was a skunk ape. Back then, in 1985, I had no idea what the hell that was, but after talking to a number of people that's had the same kind of encounters, I know in my heart it was a skunk ape that we saw. Like I said, we just needed to blow off some steam, so we borrowed a friend of mine's camper shell and drove out to the middle of nowhere in the glades just so we could be alone. We wanted to spend as much time together as we could and planned on being there for a while, maybe even going up to Georgia after that for a few weeks and staying with another one of our friends. Basically, we just wanted to stay away from our families as long as we could, so we didn't have to deal with all the ridicule they gave us about coming out. The first night we were there, all we heard were these weird hoots that sounded off in the distance. We'd never been out there before and thought it's probably just a native species of some kind, maybe an owl or some other creature, and we weren't spooked at all. We were just excited to be out there in the wilderness with nobody around but the two of us. We stayed up late that night around our campfire, just cuddling and sharing our misery about what our parents were going to do when we got back. We planned on leaving at some point and maybe even staying in Georgia for an extended period of time instead of even going home. It was just normal stuff that a couple talks about when they plan their lives together. Besides that hooting noise, of course. Looking back on it now, I should have known that it wasn't anything that should have been out there, because this thing is too big and too primate-like to actually be out there and have some species that we know already exist. I should have known, because there's no primates in the Everglades, but this was the 80s, and I didn't really know about that stuff back then. The second night, things got more aggressive. On top of all the hooting, there was also sounds like sticks breaking and logs hitting other trees. It sounded like something big was stomping around, just out of our line of sight. There's a lot of things out there, like trees and bushes and swampland, so it's hard to see since there's no lighting besides you and what you bring. The moon was shining bright enough, and we could see a little bit, but we definitely couldn't see what was out there making noise. All we had that night was our campfire and some dinky little flashlights. Again, though, we assumed it was some kind of wildlife, and it was keeping its distance because it didn't make itself known. Maybe it was just some kind of swamp deer or something that was curious about us. We shone the lights around, but there wasn't anything to see. After a while, though, as the sounds continued, and it sounded like something kept hitting sticks or logs or something on other trees, we legitimately became unnerved. Especially Camille. She's not one of the outdoor types, whereas I'm definitely an outdoors girl compared to her. The next morning we were still there, but we were to the point where we actually discussed leaving. Camille was all for it and wanted to get out of there. She wanted to just head to Georgia now so we could stay with her friend for a while. But I really wanted to have an adventure outdoors and share this with her, so I talked her into staying. I should have listened to my girl. What happened that night was definitely something that I'll never forget. Everything seemed fine during the day, and that's when we could actually see our surroundings. It just gave us a peace of mind to be able to see everywhere that we looked. But it was during nightfall that we started to get nervous again. I remember sitting out around that campfire, cooking our dinner, and we were nervous, but trying not to be. I think at this point, we were each trying to be brave for the other, so we wouldn't freak out. But you could tell that this excursion wasn't the excitement that we hoped it was going to be. We stayed really close together the entire time, even when we were eating our food. And that's when we heard something big moving around again. It sounded like somebody stomping through the leaves, to be honest. There was slushy swampland not too far from us, and it sounded like something moving through that too. Whatever this thing was, sounded unnaturally large. Like I said, we'd never been out in the Everglades, and I didn't know all the types of wildlife that could be out there, but I was under the impression that this was bigger than anything else that should be out there. Camille was worried that it was an alligator, but I told her I didn't think an alligator would be out there stomping around and making whooping noises. I didn't know much about wildlife, but I knew at least that much. And then the rock throwing started. One of those rocks actually came right into our campsite and landed on the ground next to us with a thud. That really freaked us out. Not even because a rock was thrown, but because of the unexpected noise that crashed right next to us. Both of us actually screamed. I jumped up and looked around, picked up the rock and examined it, and then I looked around thinking that maybe somebody was out there trying to give us a hard time. At this point, my mind just went to the fact that it was somebody out there screwing with us, and that was something that I could actually deal with. I started yelling out into the night, trying to piss whoever it was off, telling them to go screw themselves, and that we weren't scared, and we weren't leaving. Then the tree tapping started again, and it sounded like wood hitting wood once again, and it happened numerous times. The fact that I said we weren't scared, now it couldn't have been further from the truth, because at this point, I was almost terrified. Camille was done being adventurous and told me she was going inside, and I needed to follow her if I ever wanted to speak to her again. What can I say? That got me inside. As we sat in this tiny little camper shell, we heard more whooping, only it was closer than it was before, and whatever it was sounded more aggravated than the other nights. Even through the camper, we could hear that tree tapping again, and we could hear things hitting the ground outside of our camper shell, and sometimes even hitting the camper itself. In the morning, I would find that there were several stones that were littered around our campsite that I know were not there the previous night. But the culmination of all the excitement had to be when Camille took a peek outside and shone the flashlight, and as she did, I heard her let out the most shrill, high-pitched, terrified scream that I have ever heard her scream in all the years we've been together since then. I was hysterical, just trying to find out what was going on, and I kept yelling to her that she needed to tell me what was happening. I asked her what she saw outside, but she just kept screaming and crying and babbling. The poor girl was incoherent. I couldn't figure out what it was she saw. Finally, though, after a lot of cuddling and kissing, I calmed her down, and she said she saw something outside, but not a complete figure. All she saw was what she thinks was a shoulder, and it looked like it had thick red or brown fur, and it was off in the darkness, only partially illuminated by our flashlight. She said if it was a shoulder, it had to be 8 feet off the ground, and the fur looked thick like an orangutan. That was enough to get us to stay up the rest of the night, just clutching each other in terror and planning to get out of there as soon as we could see in the daytime. By the time the sun rose, we were exhausted. We didn't get one wink of sleep. But we did have a game plan. We ran outside, grabbed everything that we owned, and threw it wherever we could fit it in, and then we hauled ass out of there. When we were out there grabbing all of our stuff, that's when I saw all the stones that were all over the campsite. This didn't actually make Camille feel any better at all, and she sped up her packing quite a bit. When we left, we were more confused and unnerved at this experience than we had been when we started it. The thought of our families shunning us because we came out to them was not as important as this experience that we'd just seen. We had a legitimate run-in with something that we couldn't identify. As I said earlier, I had no idea what a skunk ape was, and neither did Camille, and it wasn't until later that we actually figured out what it was that we encountered. I've talked to a lot of people that have had a run-in with a skunk ape, and all of our encounters sound the same. I know 100% that this was a skunk ape that we encountered that night. Everything fits, every detail. The stone throwing, the wood knocking, even the quick sighting of the fur that Camille saw. Unless someone's pet orangutan escaped their home and was wandering around in the Everglades and terrorizing people that were minding their own business, I'm pretty sure what I saw could be classified as the skunk ape. Have a good night. Sue.
This encounter was in 2007. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and my father lives in Memphis, Tennessee. I go down to see him every year, in the summertime. At the time, I was 17, and my stepbrother and I were leaving his grandmother's house at 8:30 p.m. She lives out where all these farms are, and not a lot of houses around. While we were driving down her main road, we saw something standing on the side of the road. It was standing, so at first we thought it was a man. It was also foggy, so we were having a hard time seeing. I was like, should we ask him if he needs help? And my stepbrother said, yeah, sure, why not? We drove up closer and started to realize it wasn't a man at all. It had ears like a wolf and a tail. As we got closer, I was like, this thing's very tall, and why the hell is it standing up? I started to panic, but my brother stopped right in front of it. This thing had legs that bent back like a dog, and it had to be 7 feet tall. It was taller than our SUV. I screamed. It was just looking at the car, and then it got down on all fours to look into the car. I was face to face with this thing, with just the car window between us. It had big eyes. I mean, it looked evil, and the long face looked like a dog face. It had the body of a wolf. It had amber-colored eyes, and it was missing a lot of fur. The fur it did have was gray, but the skin was pink, like it had mange. It looked sick, actually. I really think something was wrong with it. It didn't show its teeth or anything, but it kept looking at us. I told my brother to drive fast, but he was frozen, just repeating, "What is this thing?" Finally, he snapped out of it and drove away. Looking back at it, it just started walking across the road into the woods, but now it was on all four legs. We haven't talked about it since that night. A friend of mine asked me to share my encounter with you. He's already sent in his, and told me you're into this kind of stuff. He told me not to share my exact location, but we do live in Wisconsin, and around us there are legends of the Beast of Bray Road, although I'm not from Elkhorn. Just know I'm close. Me and my daughter were coming home from her softball practice, and were passing by this very large field. What I saw at first, I just assumed were two big dogs wrestling each other. But, as we got closer, I noticed that from time to time, they would stand up on two legs and charge at each other. It was then I knew exactly what I was looking at. I pulled over to stop and watch. My daughter begged me not to. She's not a chicken, but she is only 13, so I give her some credit. She just didn't want to be around anything that she's already heard tales of. I stopped regardless, and we got out of the car to look at these things. They were smaller than what you hear about. I'd say maybe 4 to 4.5 feet tall. They both look like big wolves standing on two legs, and sometimes they look like big wolves standing on four legs. They had long, bushy tails, their legs bent backwards, and they had big muzzles. They looked like mini werewolves, to tell you the truth. One was a dark shade of brown, and the other one was lighter. The lighter one was a little bigger than the other one. I would say they were probably pups, or maybe adolescents, and I think they were just playing with each other, maybe learning how to hunt or attack. We watched them for a couple minutes. I think they were too preoccupied with each other to even notice us. The whole time we were watching them, my daughter was clutching my arm. I could tell she was scared, and I didn't want to wait around much longer, because I didn't want to traumatize the poor girl. Both of these pups would break free from rolling around with each other. They'd stand on two legs, kind of hunched over, take a few steps, before dropping back to all fours and charging at each other again. After that, we heard this howling noise, maybe even a scream, coming from the tree line. behind the field. Both of these things stopped and looked towards the trees for a second. That's when my daughter was now begging me to leave. I knew we were on the verge of overstaying our welcome, so I ushered her back to the car as quietly and quickly as I could, hopped in the car myself, turned it on, and took off. After that, we've driven by that field several times. My daughter always gets this impending feeling of doom, but we've never seen anything since. Next time, I'm going to be prepared though. If I do see them, I'm snapping a bunch of pictures, and I'll send them to everyone, as proof that the people around here in Wisconsin are not crazy, that there is something roaming the night, and it is something that we don't know anything about.
I live in Manchester, England, and before the coronavirus outbreak, my fiance and I decided to go visit my family back in Michoacan, which is in Mexico, in case anybody was wondering. My fiance and I go for the holidays, mainly in November and December, since there's more festivals and celebrations going on. We mainly go to visit my brother since he lives alone, and he always gets involved with the celebrations and festivals during the holidays. We arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, arrived at his house at night, but by the time we got there, my fiance was super tired from all the traveling and waiting, so we both decided to go to bed and call it a day. Some hours passed, and I woke up in the middle of the night and looked at the clock. It was 2:09 a.m. I tried going back to sleep, but I just couldn't for some reason. I thought about watching some TV, but I didn't since I didn't want to wake up my fiance. So I got my phone and went to the kitchen to get a glass of milk to eat with some cookies. Although I couldn't sleep, I was pretty tired, but for some reason I just couldn't fall back to sleep. Anyways, when I was reaching to the fridge, I turned to my right. I saw my brother sitting down in the living room, facing towards the TV. I couldn't see his face because the living room was too dark, so it was a bit creepy. Anyways, at this point I'm laughing nervously since I thought I'd saw something, but little did I know it would be something that will scare me even to this day. I told him he scared me, but he didn't respond, or even turn around. I thought he was still trying to scare me, so I told him it wasn't going to work. I wasn't a little kid anymore. Still, nothing though. I was assuming he probably fell asleep, or he was really trying to scare me, so I just got my stuff and went back to the room. After about an hour passed, I finally fell asleep, until I heard the front door open, and then I heard my brother go back into his room. But I was so tired at this point, I didn't get up and I let it be. The next morning, though, my fiance and I were making breakfast, and my brother asked us how we slept and if we were going good. We both said yes, and I mentioned to him what happened the night before. He looked a bit confused at me and said he had no idea what I was talking about. Again, I thought he was still trying to scare me and was keeping up his elaborate prank, so again I told him it wasn't going to work. But he honestly looked confused. He told me he didn't even get home until after 3 in the morning. I laughed to prove I wasn't falling for it, but he was adamant that he had no idea what I was talking about. It even got to the point where he started to get angry because he was clueless as to what I was talking about. I told him that I saw him sitting there last night, literally in the dark doing nothing, and I'm pretty sure he was just trying to scare me. He ended up blowing me off because he thought I was just trying to make up a story and pull a prank on him. My fiance was very confused though, and asked me what happened, since he was asleep when all of this happened, so I explained to him, and he asked me if I could be dreaming. I knew it wasn't a dream though. I knew that I was awake. He pointed out to me though that my brother honestly looked confused by what I was saying. Later that day, my brother had come back home, and we made up after that. That night, my fiance and I went to bed around 10 o'clock, and I woke up again that night, looked at the clock, and saw that it was the exact same time, 2:09 a.m. I didn't think much of it, because to be honest, I've done it before, so I got up to use the restroom, and after I was done, for some reason I went to the living room. Something just told me to go in there, and when I did, there it was again, my brother. But this time he was standing up, looking at me.
but I still couldn't see his face. He looked like a shadow person, if you ask me. Now this is the part I don't know how to explain, but I'll try my best. Something inside me told me that wasn't my brother standing there. In fact, it felt like this was something other than human. It gave me the chills, and I immediately felt sick, like I wanted to throw up. Now, I don't believe in ghosts per se, but I do believe in demons and shadow people. At this point, my anxiety began to rise, and that led me to have a panic attack, so I ran to the room and locked my door, waking my fiancé up in the process. He knows how I get when I start having a panic attack, so he told me that I had to calm down. I told him what I saw and how it made me feel. That I didn't think it was even human. I started crying, and he did the best he could to calm me down. He was getting up to see what was going on, but I quickly stopped him, and so he listened to me and told me to try to sleep. We both ended up falling asleep, but it was a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up alone in bed. I got scared, so I ran to the door, and in the kitchen, I found my brother and my fiancé looking at me. Boy, did my brother have a revelation to tell me. He told me I wasn't crazy, and that he actually knew what it was that I saw. And this is what he said to me. Last year, when you came over, we were watching TV. I remember you saying you were getting tired, and then you went to bed. I stayed up alone for another hour. Before I went to bed, I took out the trash, and I saw you outside in the garden. I didn't say anything to you, and you didn't say anything to me, so I brushed it off and went back to my room. But then I heard you laughing. I remember resting my head on the door and hearing you laugh. What I saw was your doppelganger. And so did you. You saw mine. Don't be scared. They've never really done anything to harm any of us. It's happened to a lot of people, actually. I just hope you won't ever have to have this experience again. After that, I didn't see it again. It's like it went away after we talked about it. We stayed there for 2 months, and I'd forgotten all about it, and I was able to sleep comfortably. After the 2 months were up, it was time to go back home. I packed my stuff, and my brother was outside starting the car. I was heading out until I almost forgot my phone, so I asked my fiancé if he could take the luggage out while I grabbed my phone. When I did grab my phone, I forgot to open the curtains, so I decided to open them for my brother before I headed out. And when I did, I saw it again. I saw my brother's doppelganger and my own. I quickly turned around, but they were gone. I've never mentioned that to my fiancé or my brother. I just hope the next time we go for a visit, I don't see these creatures again. I work as a ranch hand for a neighbor down the road from my house in a small town about 100 miles northeast of Dallas, Texas. I would ride my four-wheeler to the small ranch every day after school to help out and get paid a salary of $200 a week. I was riding down that country road one day, bundled up of course, since it was a November day. I looked to my right to one of the fields and see about 5 or 6 turkey vultures coming down. Curious, I stopped my four-wheeler and turned around to my house that was a mile back. I just had a bad feeling about it. When I got back, I called my boss, who we'll call Mr. X. He's a tall man that was 47 years old at the time. I told him what I saw and grabbed my .308 and a few spare rounds along with my overnight bag and a few flashlights. As I loaded them up on my four-wheeler, I told my mom and stepdad that I might stay overnight to watch the cattle. You may be wondering why I did all this and why I had a bad feeling. Well, seeing all those turkey vultures meant something out there had passed away and they were feasting on it. That means there could be a predator out there, and that's dangerous to any kind of livestock or cattle. Since it was Mr. X's property, I felt responsible to make sure that everything was okay. I rode to Mr. X's house, going about 30 miles an hour down the road, and of course, I began to see flashing lights behind me. I pulled over, cut the engine off, and took my helmet off. Then I pulled out the headphones that I was wearing. It was the county sheriff. He left his vehicle and walked over to me. He asked why I was going over the speed limit, and upon seeing my .308, He questioned me on why I had something like that with me. I told him that I thought some of my boss's calves might be getting eaten, and I needed to track down what did it, or at the very least, keep an eye out for tonight. He was understanding about the situation, but told me not to wear my headphones while I was driving. He gave me a warning and was on his way. I took off again, making sure that I was going the speed limit this time. Soon I made it to Mr. X's house, and I met up with 2 more ranch hands, who just happened to be my best friends, TJ and Hector. We were going to ride over to the fields on some of Mr. X's horses to where I saw the vultures. Mr. X decided to join us for the adventure. He wanted to make sure that his cattle were okay too. When we got there, sure enough, my intuition was correct. There were the bodies of 4 calves on the ground. It was hard to tell where one ended and one began, or what got them, as they were all spread out and in several different pieces. This was way worse than I ever thought it would be. I heard TJ audibly ask what the hell could do that. I looked over at Hector, and he was loading his AR-10 with a 15-round mag. It sounded like he was cursing in Spanish, too. Mr. X was just staring at the carnage. I didn't know what he was thinking, but he looked pissed off and scared all at the same time. We brought the horses over to a nearby stream and set up camp for the night. It was close enough to the incident that we would be able to catch sight of something if it came back. It was quiet for the most part. Eventually, we began cooking some stew from cans over the fire. As we were getting tired, we decided it'd be best to take watch. First, it was TJ's turn, and then Hector, and then I had the 3rd shift. I went to sleep pretty fast. It had been a long day after all. Sometime in the early morning, it was still pitch black out, and Hector woke me up for my shift. I got up tiredly and put my boots on. I dug in my bag for a moment for a quick energy drink and took a few first sips. I went to my post, and about 20 minutes later, as I sat there struggling not to nod off, I began to hear the sounds of an animal walking. It had light footsteps in that field. It was too light to be a cow or a calf. When the horses started to whine, I knew something was wrong. I turned on the light, and that's when I saw something. There were 2 figures in the field, and they were peeking over the grass. As the wind blew over the grass, I saw that they were standing on 2 legs. I was beginning to think that they were people, trespassers, but considering the state that the calves were in, it couldn't have been people that did that. As I shone my light on them, they flinched, and I soon realized these weren't your typical people, and they may not have been people at all. The eyes on them were at least twice as large as a normal person's, and they were completely black. There were no pupils. Beyond that, there were no features on this face. When I noticed what I was looking at, I was shocked. I jumped back before coming quickly to a standing position, because I'd been sitting on a rock overlooking the field. I walked backwards until I began stepping on the remains of the campfire. At that point, I was able to kick Hector in the side and get him to wake up. He mumbled and cursed at me, but I whispered at him to stand up and look at this. As soon as he saw it, he panicked like I had, and then started to stand perfectly still. Without taking my eyes off of things, I went over to Mr. X. I leaned down and took a shoulder, since I had Hector keeping an eye out on the creatures now. I woke him up, and TJ woke up too. When they stood up, as a group, we were silently petrified, staring at these things that didn't resemble any other living thing we'd ever seen. These creatures seemed to be staring at us, standing perfectly still and seemingly trying to stay quiet. I'm pretty sure they knew that we saw them, but luckily they were keeping their distance. Suddenly, one of the horses managed to break free from the ropes we had it tied up on, and as it began trampling towards the things in the field, it was kicking its legs up in self-defense. These things, whatever they were, still quiet, dipped down into the tall grass, and we could hear them scurrying away. We were all left standing there, dumbfounded. We'd been so creeped out and bewildered that the horse had to protect us. I'm glad it did, though. I didn't even think of opening fire on these things, because I was so caught off guard by seeing something that I didn't know what it was. We called it an early morning, and we went home. Later that day, I ended up helping Mr. X take his cattle into a different pasture, and we started setting traps in the pasture. We even put up signs on the fence post in case any thieves wanted to come by and get themselves caught in the trap. The thing is, though, we never ended up catching anything. But no more calves were taken either. It's a win-win, I guess. But it makes you wonder, where do these things go? What in the hell were they? What livestock is it that they're looking at taking next? Or have they set their eyes on people? I'd like to know any opinions that people have to tell me what exactly it was that we encountered that night.